and I take the front of the room. I'm sort of shaking, with my little index cards in front of me. There's no iPads, people. I've got my little index cards and I begin to present, and up stands a classmate, Ron, who is really outraged that I am standing in front of the class and purporting to speak about someone as important and profound as Frantz Fanon. And he lets everybody know in explicit terms, right, that he thinks I don't belong. He thinks I'm not a person who should be. If not, maybe I could sit in the class, but I need to be quiet and not sort of take, responsibility for these ideas or the learning that was going on.
Today's guest is Martha S. Jones, and I'm really just honored to share this conversation with her. She is a remarkable historian, a writer, she's a professor, among many other things. In our conversation, we discuss the profound complexities of identity, resilience, and family history as she goes through her story, reflecting on her life as a biracial woman navigating this world that's really divided by race. Martha opens up about these pivotal moments in her life, from growing up in her family during the civil rights era to this transformative and challenging experience in college that really made her have to think about her sense of belonging, and it truly shaped her path forward. Our conversation and her story is really about this power of self-discovery, the importance of storytelling, and, as she puts it, the humor and humanity that can emerge even in life's most difficult moments. So whether you've questioned your place in the world or sought to better understand the complexities of family and history and the people around you, I think you'll really enjoy this conversation. I know I did. And as I often say, these conversations heal little parts of me that I didn't know still needed healing. So thank you to Martha for this beautiful conversation, and congratulations on today's book release. Without further ado, here is my conversation with Martha S. Jones.
I'm Matt Gilhooly, and this is The Life Shift, candid conversations about the pivotal moments that have changed lives forever. Hello, my friends. Welcome to the Life Shift podcast. I am here with Martha. Hello, Martha.
Hi, Matt.
Thank you for wanting to be a part of the Life Shift podcast. I'm sure listeners by this point know that I've been talking to you for a few minutes and we've already had our whole conversation. So now we're going to record it.
Super. I'm here for that. Thank you.
Well, for anyone that's listening for the first time, maybe you're tuning in because Martha is a guest on the show. The Life Shift podcast really comes from my own personal experience. In 2022, I got a second master's degree because I was bored during the pandemic. And I took a podcasting class and I was like, oh gosh, what am I going to talk about? What am I going to record these 2 required episodes about? And I thought, well, I should probably do something that I'm afraid of. I should probably talk about things that scare me, because I can't be the only one that has these feelings inside. And so the Life Shift came about because when I was 8, my dad had the unfortunate experience of having to sit me down and tell me that my mom had died in a motorcycle accident and that my life was going to change at that moment in time. Everything that my parents ever imagined for me was gone. And now we had to create this new life together. This was 1989. So I don't think there were a lot of people really talking about mental health or grief, especially for kids. I think it was very much, oh, they'll bounce back. They're kids. So I assumed all that because all the adults around me were like, wanted me to be happy. So I was like, oh, well, I have to show them I am happy. Behind the scenes, I always wondered, are there other people like me in which this one moment, this line in the sand moment, changed everything? Turns out we have a lot of those. But in my grief journey, I was so focused on that one moment that it was really, really significant, pivotal moment in my life. And I know I would not be this person that I am now if I had not had that experience as a child and the 20 years of failing at grief after that. So now I have the Life Shift podcast and I get to talk to people like you, Martha, and hundreds, I guess I could say at this point, of other people sharing these stories And what I've really learned is although we have wildly different stories for most people, there are so many similarities into the way that we feel about things or we approach things or the way we internalize things that I've grown so much more than I ever could imagine just by listening to other people's stories. So I am so very honored that you would want to share your story on this show.
Well, I think I'm the one that's honored first. It's important to say because I know that you have your own story, but that you have been the shepherd for many, many people. As you said, I think you told me earlier, 170 plus episodes. And to me, that's remarkable because you can't help but, I think, absorb other people's stories. You can't just sort of listen to them as a podcast host. And that to me is remarkable because I think our stories about grief, about loss, about pain, about dislocation are oftentimes the stories that folks tune out because they are hard to hear, hard to absorb. So I'm grateful to you for making space for me and my story. But I know we are making space for lots of other folks and their stories too.
Yeah, I think it's so important to what you just said. I think some people shy away from things that feel really hard because they don't know how to just listen. I don't think we have to do anything other than just listen, right? We don't have to solve. We feel like we do. We feel like something's broken, we need to fix it. But I've found in this journey that just listening can help the storyteller sort through things, feel better. It can help listeners to some of these stories feel less alone because maybe, like I did as that 8-year-old, I knew I wasn't the only 8-year-old with a dead parent, but at the same time, I felt like I was the only 8-year-old without a parent, like missing a parent. So the idea that people like you and myself and other people that share their stories, we're helping people that we'll probably never even meet feel less alone in that journey or that circumstance that they're in. I've talked to a lot of people. It doesn't have to be this tragedy. It doesn't have to be something like so devastatingly hard, right? I talked to people about one day they got this email and it lit this fire in them in a positive way. They changed their whole life around to do something really that they've always dreamed of doing.
I love that.
And so other people listening might be at that same pivotal moment where they're just like, oh, maybe I could do it. Maybe I could try. So it's just, the power of story is so beautiful. I wish I knew the power of story when I was 10, 15, 20, 25. But here I am, and I'm lucky in my 40s to be able to have these conversations. So let's get into your story. But before we dive into your pivotal moment, maybe you can tell us who Martha is in 2025. However you want to describe yourself.
Sure. Well, I'm talking to you from my home in Baltimore, Maryland. And I've been in Baltimore now coming on 8 years. And I came here because I'm a teacher, a researcher, a writer, a historian. And I work at a university here in Baltimore. I live here with my husband, who is also a historian. So we are two kind of book nerds on steroids. This morning we high-fived over breakfast around book stuff. That's what it's like in my house.
That you're probably really good at Jeopardy too.
Right. Yeah, a lot of, well, I don't want to say useless because on Jeopardy it would be useful, but otherwise a lot of knowledge. But more recently, because I've been at this for a while, I've turned to being more concertedly a writer. And so I long done a lot of professional writing and publishing, but these days I'm writing more personal narratives, telling my story and the story of my family. So I'm in a moment here as a historian and writer and teacher and sometimes, a public intellectual, as they sometimes call us.
It's a lot of pressure.
I've been trying to think of another term for public intellectual because I don't like it very much, but you get the point, I hope.
Yes, of course.
But really experiencing and your invitation, to join you here on the podcast is an example of that, really experiencing what it's like to, in a sense, turn the camera on myself and to open up in a way that, a lot of us in work life, it doesn't require us to reveal or to think hard about ourselves. We get to keep a demeanor that keeps those things protected, but also hidden. And so I'm at a moment where I'm trying to discover what it's like to talk about things that are closer to me, closer to my heart. Yeah, so here I am.
Are you finding that to be difficult or challenging or beautiful or all the pieces?
I think it's all the things, right? Because I'm still at the stage where I share something. I have a new book that's coming in some weeks, and I've been sharing it bit by bit with family, with other writers, and you kind of hold your breath until somebody comes back and says something, and it. And for those of you out there who have said nothing to me, it's okay, but I'm still holding my breath because it is so new, it is so different, and it is so personal. So I think it's all the things kind of all at once.
Were you brought up to kind of keep things like
Oh,
separate and hidden
oh my
and
gosh.
okay? Because I
Totally.
was too. I mean, I
Yeah.
think it's a new thing.
I was raised, that you kept all of the dirty laundry, right? I don't know if that metaphor still holds for people, but in my day we called it dirty laundry,
Yeah, you
right?
don't
And
air
you
that.
you don't air it. And you button yourself up and you wash your face and you straighten your dress and you go out into the world and don't let people see what might be going on. And I think that's, partly an ethic that comes out of my particular family. I think it's also cultural, which is to say that I don't know. My husband comes from a French family of the Mediterranean, and they talk about everything and very loud and very animated and very unself-conscious. And I find that fascinating because I really didn't come from a family like that. And in these recent years where I've been trying to write about my family, bumping up again and again against the realization that I remember this, but we never talked about it. Right. And so I don't really know everything about how my parents might have felt or a sibling might have felt. So there's a legacy, I guess, is what I'm trying to say, that comes with that kind of family. And then we have questions about ourselves when we break the silence, right? Or we violate the code.
The unwritten code.
Yeah, the unwritten code. And so I'm there.
I think it's beautiful. I love it for you. I would imagine if you're teaching like college age individuals too, you're probably seeing some of that freedom ish more so, I guess, maybe than 10, 15, 20 years ago. I mean, I started being open about how I was feeling probably in my mid 30s was when I kind of had my breakthrough in my grief journey with my mom. And then my grandmother got sick and I did all the right things when she was dying and spent her last 96 hours with her and did all the things that I couldn't do with my mom. But after that, I was like, you know what? It doesn't matter. This is my story. So I can tell my story how I see it. And if it doesn't align with the people that were in my lives, then that's their story. It's a different one, And so I love this for you. I hope you are finding that joy and feeling that peace and the connection. So I think that's a perfect segue into sharing your story. Maybe you can paint the picture of your life leading up to this pivotal moment, and you can go back wherever you need to go to kind of give us the picture that you want to paint.
Sure. Uh, I was born, does ever begin? I was born, and I
No.
was born, I was born at the end of the 1950s. And that's important because in my family story, we're really still in the early years of what we come to think of as the civil rights era. And my parents met in New York City in the 50s. She from Buffalo, New York, the child of working class German immigrants. and he, a Black American from North Carolina. So when they marry in 1957, it is still illegal in 17 or 18 states, including his home state of North Carolina.
Makes no sense to me.
No, but, but made sense to a whole lot of people in the 1950s. And still, we're still 10 years away from the Supreme Court finally in 1967 saying that it's unconstitutional to bar marriage across the color line. So, they marry in New York, and I'm born the next year. And there are a lot of questions that sort of run through a family like ours, not the least of which is how should people regard us as children, right? My parents seem to fit more or less neatly on one side or the other of some imagined color line. But children, whom today we would call mixed race, today we would call, multiracial, those categories didn't exist. I hate, I don't know if I hate to tell people that, but I think it's important, that those kind of categories didn't exist. And we live a kind of a life that moves through many kinds of worlds. I'm born in New York City. I spend my earliest years in central Harlem, where we live. We spend a lot of time in the South with my father's mother in North Carolina. But my mother's family is in Buffalo, and we spend time there, which is a very different kind of world. And then when I'm 4, we moved to the suburbs, to Long Island, where my parents buy a tiny, tiny tract house on the GI Bill. My father had been in the Navy. And I go to school. And, I am teased. I am queried. Sometimes I'm hassled. But I grow up thinking more or less that while I'm not like other kids, kids by nature are teased and hassled. And I wasn't sure, or maybe I hoped that I would outgrow that or that would fall away as I went to college. And I'm going to stop there because that takes me to my pivotal moment.
I mean, I would imagine, I'm thinking of you now with all this context of the history and the stuff that and all the research that you've probably done over the years, looking back on your childhood or when your parents met and thinking how this is not the right words, but how like far we've come, but also not how far we've and how much we've regressed. And does that cloud when you reflect back on as a child, does that cloud any of that? Like you fill in gaps because because the history, all the pieces?
Well, that's the historian in me, right? That I can, in a sense, create just enough distance between myself, the girl, right, still in me, and that past, because I can fill in so much context. And my editor on this memoir, she would call it, when I would do that on the page, she would call it cheating. She would say, "You're cheating again," right? Instead of getting to the heart of things, right? Instead of telling us what that felt like, what that meant for you, what that meant for the people around you, you're giving me lots of very interesting context, but she understood that as a way of avoiding. So part of the process in these last years for me has been, yes, I know a great deal and I could narrate for you, all day, the history of race and segregation and interracial marriage. And those are important contexts for my life and the life of my family. But I was trying to get to something else. And that meant not overindulging in that more analytic way of thinking about the past.
So as a child growing up, did you notice how your parents were being treated? Were those things like super noticeable? I think of myself as a kid and I'm like, did I pay attention to those things? Was I in my own world? Did everyone know that I had a dead parent? Like, I don't remember a lot of that. And that was probably trauma informed, but that's probably a whole other story. But did you notice the things that were happening and you feel they were different, or did it just feel normal for you?
No, I absolutely did. And I think that to some degree, they wanted me, and I should say ultimately us, because I have two beautiful siblings, that they wanted us to understand, I think mostly the political moment in which we were coming of age. When we moved to what was an all white enclave in the suburbs, they are ostracized and threatened. And at the same time, there are neighbors who are more sympathetic to us as children and extend, a friendly invitation or a welcome. But we're aware. And then it's the sick. Now it's 1962, 1963, 64. Civil rights has become, our family embodies, part of this national and international story. And so we see parts of our lives mirrored, on the nightly news and in the newspaper. And I was the kind of kid, I am not unique. I'm the kind of kid who's always kind of listening in on the adult talk because I'm nosy, but also because
Curious.
I'm trying to understand the world, right? And I'm curious. So I do know that, and at the same time, to go back to our earlier point, we're not talking about this in wholly open, you know, free terms, right? We're getting lessons, we're getting news, but mostly we're left to ourselves to manage how it feels, whether you are hurt or frightened or just unsure, right, of the world and where you stand in it.
I would imagine as a parent, you want to like empower your children in a way, not to scare them, not tell them all the things that we as parents are feeling at certain times. So I could imagine how that goes. Did you have other families that were similar to yours near you? Or were you truly like feeling like you were the only ones like this in your space?
Right. We did not.
Okay. That makes it challenging.
And so there wasn't I didn't have a story in my head about family like ours. I didn't see examples of families like ours. And I very keenly felt, though it wasn't true, right? Of course, if you look at the big picture, but in our little world, we were particular and we were peculiar, right, for people.
And you probably logically knew that you weren't the only families that were like that, but at the same time, you do feel like that. It's like how I said I felt like I was the only kid who had a dead parent. It's like I know that it can happen, but it feels very isolating in that. Why don't you tell us what your pivotal moment is? Because I know it feeds right into this, and I think it's so it's disappointing, I guess, is my perspective without knowing too much.
Yeah. I finished high school, barely, but I do finish high school. It's another story. And I go to college in upstate New York. And I arrive, and remarkably, I'm very clear about what I intend to study. And I become a psychology major, and I become a Black Studies minor. It's 1976, so Black Studies as a scholarly field is really just being born, is just coming into being. It's an extremely exciting moment. The faculty are young, they're very political, and they are literally inventing the wheel in this area of study. And I have an opportunity at my college to minor and to study with some really remarkable folks. And I don't think too much about I don't think too much about the teasing or the questions or the other troubling stuff that I had experienced during high school around how I looked or how I didn't look to people. And maybe I even imagined, fantasized that I was going to leave that behind, right? That I was going to I was away from home. I was away from that kind of small world of a suburb. And now I was in the real world, or a version of it, with grown-ups and big ideas. But it was true that in my Black Studies class, my presence unsettled some students, one in particular. My Black sociology professor had me make an oral report on a book that is still one that is read and so important today, Frantz Fanon's A Dying Colonialism, about the battle between France and its one-time colony of Algeria. But Fanon is a psychiatrist and a philosopher and a deep thinker about race and racism. And I read the book. I barely understand it, but I'm going to prepare an oral report, and I show up to give my report, and I take the front of the room. I'm sort of shaking, with my little index cards in front of me. There's no iPads, people. I've got my little index cards, and I begin to present, and up stands a classmate, Ron, who is really outraged that I am standing in front of the class and purporting to speak about someone as important and profound as Frantz Fanon. And he lets everybody know in explicit terms, right, that he thinks I don't belong. He thinks I'm not a person who should be. If not, maybe I could sit in the class, but I need to be quiet and not sort of take, responsibility for these ideas or the learning that was going on. And, there's some funny moments in the story. He says to the professor, Fanon was from Martinique, and he says, well, she doesn't even know where the French Antilles are. And ultimately my answer is they're in France, but I have no idea. I'm really just making it up. It's awful. And and class ends. I finish the report, class ends, and I go back to my dorm room, really, really shaken. But I share this, as I do at the beginning of the book, because in some ways it was just an indelible moment that let me know that the questions that I had once thought were teasing were deeper, or much more profound than that my presence really troubled people, so much so, right, that someone would interrupt a report and stand up in a class and object. It also connected, to questions that I also had, right, about who I was and how I fit into a world that seemed to be divided between Black and white. And so, as painful as it was, it also set me on a course of, self-exploration, of learning more about my own family. And, ultimately, as I said today, a professor of, history and Black history.
So that moment in the class, you said that it kind of reminded you of questions you had asked yourself in this, maybe not the exact questions or not the same way. Did that trigger something, or was there shame that comes with that? What is the emotion that comes with that when you realize someone just called me out for things that I might also think about myself, which are not necessarily quote unquote valid questions because I am who I am?
Yeah. Shame is definitely one feeling. Sense that I should be not only self-conscious, but perhaps embarrassed and even apologize for the lightness of my skin, or the limpness of my hair, or in those days, my definite suburban diction. So shame is one feeling, but not the only one. I would say, at the same time, a very quiet kind of anger or rage, that said, as I did to myself back in my room, right, where I didn't have to confront anyone, which is like, who do I think I am? Who do you think you are? Who do you think you are calling me out? But that was a very quiet voice, and not one that I could, express full-throatedly. And then I think there's the genuine puzzle, right? Or confusion, right? So where is the place for someone like me if it's not in this classroom? And I should say, I went back to the class and I finished the class and I took many other Black Studies classes in those years, including with Ron, who became a friend over
Really?
time. Yeah. But
because he learned who you were?
yeah,
He got to know you?
we did, we did. We were both interested in student government and the student newspaper. And so we met under other circumstances where we could know each other, less in stark terms about identity and more, what do you think about the new policy in education coming out of Albany, the state capital, or, what do you think about the new rules about vending machines on campus? We had lots to talk about, and we were interested in the same things. But it's also true that we never talked about what had happened in the class. And I didn't then, and maybe, this is a lifelong, if not a quest, but a query for me, right? How to explain in a soundbite who you are. Really, I think a lot of us feel cheated, if what we get, are like two boxes and a nod. It's not enough to tell anybody who you are, and labels and boxes, and stereotypes are really not very satisfying.
But at the time, I feel like those boxes were much more narrow. I feel
Absolutely.
like now you could spend a lot of time, because we have more language around the different ways we can describe ourselves. I'm thinking of that time period in which, like, everyone was so, things were emerging, but people were so divided, and it was either this or that. It wasn't a whole spectrum of who we could be as individuals, not just our backgrounds, but all the things that we bring to the table as humans. We're also, and I'm imagining this is true for you because I can see it in the other generations in my family, of like, you're just also not taught to express all those pieces. Were you conditioned to, you have to be this or that, or do you feel like you were given the freedom to be you and not necessarily a bucket?
I think my parents maybe weren't of one mind, and that sort of contributes, right, to how kids are able to figure things out or not. When I look back at my mother and I think about her, I think my mother, perhaps naively, but I think generously at the same time, wanted to imagine that we could just be whoever we were. And she wasn't going to
As you should be.
speak to us about labels and insist on that. Now, my father, right, who had grown up in segregated America, knew that people would buy the good old one drop rule, if nothing else, determine that we were Black, even if that was complicated and not self-evident. And he wanted us to know very clearly what that meant historically and sociologically and in lived experience. And the wrinkle, I think, in my family, but I don't think it's unique, is that, my mother's family pretty much disowned her when she married my father. And so we didn't know her family. I certainly didn't. I didn't identify with them in any way. And so I was really raised as a Black person, as a family matter, as a cultural matter, even if my appearance and even if my mother complicated that. And I was comfortable with that. But what I was learning, right, and what Ron made apparent, was that I might be comfortable with that, but that wasn't the whole story, right? There was the other part of the story, or at least one other part of the story, was how other people would discern and read me. And I was going to have to contend with that no matter who I thought I was. I could have a strong sense of self and identity, and I still was going to have to live in a world where how other people see you matters, and has consequences, even as you might push back against that.
Yeah. Did you feel like a sense of responsibility to prove something to people, like who you were? Did you feel the responsibility to educate them, to tell them they were a bunch of idiots? Like, how did you, like, did you take on the world in this sense of like, I am who I am. I don't necessarily, do I need to teach you like my DNA and all these pieces that makes me a full human?
Mm-hmm. Um, the answer is yes, in part because I want to be in the world, right? I want to be in. And so it has felt important at times to make myself legible to people, even if that's complicated, right? But to make myself legible. But as a young person, right, I really didn't. The thing I took away from that moment with Ron was that the story I wanted to tell him was about my family, that I look the way I do because I come from a family and a history of some things, almost unspeakable, right? I come from, a line of enslaved women who were exploited sexually by slaveholders. I also come from parents, right, who the spirit of civil rights, right, crossed the color line and married. But as a young adult, I didn't know enough of that story or how to organize it. And frankly, nobody's really asking you to, like, nobody's really interested in sitting down with you and having you like recite, generations of your family. But for me, like, that was the story I really thought had integrity, right? That people don't understand. Okay, I would allow for that, right? That people don't understand how someone comes to look the way I do. There is a story about that, but most of the time when you're having a social encounter with people, they're not there for you to pull them aside and tell them a long tale about your family, which is why very late in my own life story, my own journey, as you put it so nicely, I finally wrote a book, right? I was the person whose way of telling stories is writing, and I could put together the story well enough to finally kind of tell it in a full-throated way.
I'd love to go back to Ron, but first, just because you just said that, do you feel that in this journey of like writing your story in your words, in your way, knowing the context that you have, did it fill in any potential gaps that you had in like an example? This show, talking to people, helps heal me in little ways through all these conversations, ways that I didn't know that I needed to be healed. Did any of your writing journey help you piece things together that maybe were a little fractured?
Yes. I mean, it was all, a kind of puzzle. I had stories, that I had inherited. I had writings by some of my ancestors. I had lots of, official, like, artifacts like birth certificates and death certificates. There was a lot to work with. And so I hope, I put together the pieces of the puzzle well enough that it holds together as a story that explains who we've been and how it's felt to be us. But the thing I didn't expect, and this is the thing I want to say, because it still surprises me, is that somehow on the other side of all that very kind of meticulous, I hope thoughtful, reflection and probing, I found a sense of humor. I found the humor in it. There is a way in which, of course, race in America is as serious, as grave, as powerful a set of ideas as any. Regretfully so, in large part, but very powerful, and that must be taken up with due care and respect. But somehow, I really began to see how absurd some of it is, right? Trying to, the infinite ways in which this country has tried to create boxes, put us in boxes, draw lines. I used to be afraid of the people in my family who tried to defy the lines. I had a great grandmother who, from time to time, passed as white when she wanted to shop in a department store or go to a movie. And I was embarrassed about that for the longest time. But after writing this book, I admired her and had to laugh at some of what she pulled off, that because she was really in her own way flaunting, right, all the rules
No shame.
and self-consciously so, and no shame. And I began to see the absurdity and find a kind of wry humor in a lot of that I had never ever known.
Yeah. When you said that, I was like, yeah, I think I started out our conversation just saying like how it's so silly that we're still like thinking these ways. And when you said you found the humor, I was like, yeah, because it doesn't make any sense because we're human beings. Like that's all that should matter. Like what does a color do? I mean, I just, and this is
I
super
hear you.
ignorant and naive of me, but
no, I hear you. And I think in an ideal sense, I probably would, co-sign just that. And at the same time, I think that the way the wheels are turning, even as we sit here and we're
I know.
talking to each other, human to human, we know that our world is still, divvying us up and dividing us and creating hierarchies, old hierarchies, new hierarchies. And so that there is a profound graveness to the lie, right, that is race. And I would say that there is also a joy that is not derived from being boxed in or labeled or, held to somebody else's standard. But I think in my life, because I'm a historian of Black America, far beyond the boundaries of my own family, I can also say that, we have transformed on many days and in many contexts, right? The racism, if I could put it that way, that created these categories and out of them created culture and community that is deeply meaningful and sustaining and a pleasure. And so I think both of those things can be true, if that makes sense.
I agree. Just by saying that, I think anyone that has ever been othered in some way finds their group, finds their people, finds their way of surviving and loving life and doing the things that the people around them also love to do. So I agree with you completely. I think surface level, none of it makes sense to me. And I guess maybe that's a good thing. But, I just want to know the person. I don't care any of the other pieces. And it's probably super privileged and naive of me. But at the same time, I talk to so many different people across the world through this podcast. And these stories have so many through lines, whether it's the same story or not. And, as people, we feel similarly about different experiences, if that makes any sense.
I do. And I had, long before I was contemplating a book, I wrote an essay for CNN. It was called, the title is never yours, but it was called Biracial and Also Black, which I can own. That's apt.
Fair.
But here's the thing that happened. I had a friend who read it, whose family history is very different than mine. He's a Jewish American with one parent who was an Ashkenazi Jew and the other was a Sephardic Jew. And he said, your story made so much sense to me because I also come from a mixed family. And it's not mixed like yours, but let me tell you that the clashes and the misunderstandings and the negotiations and more, they were real in his family as they were in mine, and in a world where people have expectations and boxes and assumptions about who you are, the necessity to make yourself legible to people. And I think today in the US, where so many people are growing up in blended families, complicated families. In a way, I think my kind of story is not as unique as it might have been, when I was a young person, because look around us and we see all kinds of Americans and not Americans, if I could add that importantly, but we see all kinds of people loving each other, making families, blending families from near and far. And in that are new ways of knowing and understanding who we are, and new complexities to navigate and figure out, new language to discover about how to describe that. And today you can watch it on TikTok. There's something called the biracial lounge, and I go on there all the time, but it's young people telling their versions of, if you will, my story by very different terms than I have told my own. And I love seeing that and appreciating how this is not a sidebar in our American family story. It's really one of these stories.
Yeah. Does seeing more of your family, seeing more of that in the world, does that make you feel any better, different, involved, connected? Are there any feelings as you see more people that represent how you might have felt as a child?
I think
You don't have to say yes.
no, I think the answer is yes. And because these are moments in which you see a version of yourself reflected back. And this is, I think, a very old insight, about what it means to look across the world, or to watch television, or to, look at political candidates, or, choose your scene, right? But how meaningful it is to see someone who seems to be like you, and what an invitation that is, what a reassurance that is, or what a pleasure that is.
Yeah, because growing up, you didn't get to see any examples of you grown up,
Yeah.
right? Like you didn't have like, oh, this is who I could be. I mean, you probably did and logically thought through it or dreamed about it, but like you don't see the examples of these people that were going to be successful and do all the things that you had dreamed of doing.
Yeah. I mean, I would, I'll invoke, one of the more famous mixed race Americans, Barack Obama, who very poignantly, when folks began to probe his family history and reveal its complexity, Obama said, well, that's American history, isn't it? That's who we are, and that's as American as any family story. And I guess that's what I'd want to say to my young self, right? That your family is as American as any, and don't let anybody tell you otherwise. But it took me a while to get there.
I do want to just circle back to Ron. When you stood up there shaking your paper and worried about getting that oral report out of your mouth and into the ears of the people around you, you probably felt differently than you did that later that night in your dorm room. What do you think changed the most by those words that he uttered, or that conversation that you guys had, or the confrontation, I guess, maybe?
I think I had to put on a bit of armor.
Mm.
And I didn't have to, but I did put on armor and begin to think in ways that anticipated the questions that people had about me, whether they voiced them or they didn't voice them. And probably I misread people, probably I was defensive in situations where I need not have been.
But you had to protect yourself.
I wore a kind of armor, and I lived with a kind of wariness about, I think that why that was such a pivotal moment for me, was being called out in public, kind of naked in the front of the classroom. And that is different, I think, than even teasing on the playground, or somebody who's unkind to you, at work or in a social setting. It was sort of, you're standing up there all by yourself, and now somebody is saying, who do you think you are? Wow.
It's like questioning your validity as a human. Like
I think a version of that. Yeah.
Did it feel like, did you, it sounded like you went to college with this hope, I had the world is my oyster kind of hope. Did it diminish any of that, or did you still retain some of that hope for a brighter future?
I think the hope kind of morphed into a stubbornness, frankly, which is to say,
Which is protection.
I continued to show up in the places I wanted to show up. I continued to study the things I wanted to study and do the kind of work I wanted to do. I certainly learned how to build a community of people who could see me more or less and could embrace me despite, if I could put it that way, despite, whatever ambivalences my looks might generate for them or the people around them. So I think that stubbornness is not everything, but it helped me to move forward in the world with a kind of deep integrity about who I knew I was and who I wanted to be and become. Yeah, grateful for that, even if it was not everything.
No, I mean, I also think of these moments in our lives where they seem terrible in the moment, but maybe they were like so good for us in this way. Do you look at that moment as something that was actually, if we get down to the nuts and bolts of it, really positive shift in your life?
Well, I think you could say, I mean, Ron taught me something that I needed to know, which is that people had questions. And I was going to be subjected to those questions from time to time. And I better learn how to tolerate them and answer them as best I could. And that, yes, I would go on myself to be a teacher. Years ago now, I taught a class on interracial marriage in America, something like that. It had a better title, but that was the gist of it. But I had, the room filled with young people who came, a lot of them from families like mine or were contemplating making families like mine. And I thought, okay, now Ron's question and the journey that it set me on has a purpose far beyond my own life. And I can be here for young people who have their own questions and their own answers, and they're not mine and all that. But, that's extraordinary. And I don't know if you said it before we went on air or not, but you were talking about, how out of grief, out of pain, out of the difficult moments, when we survive them, we are made into new people. And I think he was an agent in that. So I have a deep gratitude for him, even if it's a tough memory.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I say the same, and it's so hard to say because obviously I don't want my mother to die. I don't want her to die in a tragic way. But at the same time, all the things that have happened because of it, good, bad, indifferent, brought me to this version of me. So if I look back and if I could wave a magic wand, I don't know if I would change it.
Mm.
And it's really terrible to say that out loud, but it's true because I don't know. I like this version of me. And I know that I would not be this version of me had I not gone through all of that. So that's kind of where that question comes from. It's like, sometimes, well, actually, it relates to how I look at other people's stories. I'm like, these people that are online telling me about all their wins and all the things, all the beautiful moments in their lives, congratulations, but I can't relate. I relate to so many more of the valleys of people's lives and how they navigated that with authenticity. I have a shirt on right now that I made that says, all your feelings are valid. Because for so long, all of my feelings were not valid.
Yeah.
I was only allowed to be happy or mad. And once I realized that I was allowed to be sad, I was allowed to be depressed, I was allowed to feel the gamut of emotions, that was when I became like a full person, And so it's just, I'm so honored that you let me ask these questions, even if I said something that sounded super privileged or confused or whatever that may be, because this is how we learn about other people, how to exist as a full human in the world. So I just want to say thank you for allowing all of this.
No, I thank you. These are new kinds of conversations for me. But I think what comes through, if I could put it that way, for me, is, the kind of wisdom that you have accumulated in doing this work through your own life, but through the conversations. And so I appreciate you making space for me to, talk with you in real ways. It's much appreciated.
I think we just need to have, well, you and I, we need to have more conversations. But in general, I think humans need to have just real conversations. We don't need to stay on the surface. We can ask uncomfortable questions. And if they're too uncomfortable, then we need to feel safe enough to say that they're uncomfortable and not answer them, and have that autonomy to be like, not today, maybe another time, but this is how we learn to exist together and not repeat things of the past, and, just learn to be good humans. So I appreciate you. I love to kind of wrap up the conversations with a question. And you kind of said, if you could go back to younger Martha, you would say, you are an American family. You exist in this world just like everyone else. If you could go back to Martha, who was just about to do her oral report before her life was a little shaken up, is there anything you'd want to tell her?
First, I'd want to tell her you needed to do a little more homework. Because you really, where are the French Antilles would have been a good thing to know before you got to the class. But okay, I was a freshman, and I forgive myself for that. No, I think that it's not a regret, right? But if you got a do-over, I would have hung around after class, right? I would have talked to the professor about what happened. I would have learned how he saw it. Maybe Ron would have hung around. Maybe, I think, as you're saying, I would have just challenged myself just enough to begin those conversations. Now, I don't know where they would have gone, but I'll say the professor was a kind, generous instructor who I took more than one class with. And maybe he would have. I'm sure he had something to say. And I missed that, right? I missed that because I was too scared and too shaken, and no judgment. But I think I would have tried to hang in there. That's what I do today, right? In tough moments, I try and stay in the room, stay at the table.
That's beautiful.
But I had to learn to do that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we do. I would go back and I'd be like, dude, go get some therapy, figure this out before you're 30 something. Because, but at the same time, I needed to struggle. You needed to go to your dorm room and do what you needed to do and put on your shield and, put your armor and face the world in the direction that you needed to go. And I think it's beautiful. And now you're going to help more people with this book. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about the book, and then we kind of find out how people can get in touch with you.
Yeah.
Tell us about the book.
Thank you. The Trouble of Color, an American family memoir, looks to answer Ron's question, who do you think you are? And my answer is, I come from a family of people for whom color has always been a troubling dimension, a reflection of the trouble in their lives. And so back to my great-great-grandmother, Nancy Bell Graves, who was born in Danville, Kentucky in 1808, born enslaved, and was more or less my color. Well, that's a difficult story because that's a story about slavery, about the sexual exploitation of enslaved women. But I follow each generation. And what I learned is just that each generation tells its own story. And so it's really a collection of stories and a deep appreciation for how in each generation we tell the stories we need to speak to our own time. And so in a way, The Trouble of Color is my talking with them across time about my version of this experience.
Yeah, that's beautiful. You probably saw such stories of resilience through things that you and I could never imagine living through. And thankfully in that way, but the resilience that the human spirit has is just unbelievable at times.
Yeah, I think resilience, humor, cunning, and also blundering, right? And hurt, and disappointment, and confusion. I think it's a very human story. And I'll say I was determined to tell it as frankly as I could, which is to say, there are no saints, and there are no sinners. There are human beings in this story who live complicated lives and make complicated choices, live in complicated circumstances. But on whole, I hope they tell us something about what it means to be a family and how American families get made.
Yeah, I look forward to it. When does it come out? What is the
March
date?
4th.
March 4th, which very well could be close to the release date of this. So probably by the time that this episode is out. So while you're listening to it, there's going to be a link in the show notes. So what's the best way to find your book or connect with you?
Sure. I say you will find The Trouble of Color anywhere you buy your books, thanks to my publisher's Basic Books, online at your local indie bookseller and more. So please go where you support your indie bookseller is what I would say always. And you can find me at marthasjones.com, and you can read a lot more about this book and my other books and other writings and projects that I have. And I look forward to seeing people out there in the world, I hope, so I can hear more about their stories about family and the color line.
I would love that. If someone is listening now and you know someone in your life that might need to hear this story or hear our conversation, really, please send it to them. We would love that. And, as I said earlier, you never know who's out there listening that might need to hear something that you, Martha, said that makes them feel less alone in their experience, or, oh my gosh, I felt that same way. I thought I was the only one that felt that way, kind of thing. So please share this with others. And I just want to really, from the bottom of my heart, thank you for wanting to be a part of this and then for going through it. It was really a wonderful conversation.
I thank you so much, Matt.
If you are listening and you like the show, I would love a rating and review. I'm supposed to say that. I guess it sounds great. But with that, I'm going to say goodbye, and I'll be back next week with a brand new episode of the Life Shift podcast. Thanks again, Martha.
For more information, please visit www.thelifeshiftpodcast.com.